Great. Well, thank you very much. So as we talked about today, we're here to talk about getting started with Vue 3's composition API, which for those who have been following Vue for a little while, this has been sort of like the buzzword that's been coming around, especially when it comes to Vue 3. So as far as a quick overview, as far as introductions, Vitaly had gone over some of this, but I'm a big fan of basically amusement parks. So for those who aren't in the United States, this is from Orlando, Florida, and at the Universal Studios Islands of Adventure. So this is where like a Jurassic Park themed adventure. And so you can see this is a ride where you drop about 80 feet on this, giant water ride. And if you can't see me, I am up here in the upper right with both of my arms up and just having an absolute blast. But in case you're wondering though, don't worry, this photo was taken much, much long ago, back in 2017. So I haven't been back to the amusement park since, but certainly do miss it and look forward to a time when we can safely go and attend these incredibly designed parks again. So for those who might have followed me for a little bit, you might know me primarily for my work on the Vue docs as a Vue core team member. And if you're looking for me on the Internet of Things, you can find me basically under all of the monikers at Ben Codes End. So I mean, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. I may even have a TikTok, just been exploring that a little bit, but you can basically find me on all the things there. So if you're looking for me, check it out. All right, so let's dive into the meat of it. What is the composition API? Well, at its core, really what the composition API at the end of the day is simply another way to build your Vue apps and organize your code. And so let that sink in for a second, because when Vue 2 was basically created, we had something called the options API. And most people don't know that's what it's called because that was just basically the only way to do things. And so let's do a quick review for those who might not be as familiar as with Vue as far as what the options API is. So here is the very simple counter app basically that we have from Vue. And so for those who have been building with Vue 2, this should look familiar. Here we have basically our JavaScript in the top in our script block, and we have the HTML that we're rendering on the bottom in the template block. And so what you see here is that inside how we've been defining things typically in Vue 2 projects has been through various options. So we can see here that we have things like data, computed, and methods. So data, again, as a quick review for those who aren't familiar with Vue, data is what tracks all of the reactive data properties you want Vue to update and basically keep track of. So in this case, this is count. So basically, whenever it's updated, Vue will make sure that it's populated and changed in all the relevant locations. So in the example below, we have our template being rendered. If we were to increment our count, for example, it would make sure to update the HTML as well. We also have our computed property here, which basically contains a bunch of basically cached data properties that we want to run calculations against based on our dependencies in data. And so this is really useful because a lot of times when you have reactive data, you want to compose them together in a way that can be reused. And so computed properties allow you to do that in a performant way without having to think much of it. So in this case, we have a computed property called double count. And what it does is it tracks the count inside of the data, and then it multiplies that by 2. So if we were to print that out inside of our template, for example, it would at this time it would say 0, but if the count increments it to 1, it would say 2, and basically it would keep track as time goes on. And so computed properties are definitely one of the best things about Vue, and I absolutely love it. It makes life so much easier when it comes to sort of organizing your code and making calculations easier to track. And finally, on the bottom, we have this methods option, which basically contains functions that we give Vue access to. And when I say functions, these are just normal JavaScript functions that we run based on things like click events or any other things that we want to basically handle inside of our Vue app. And so as we see here, we have an increment count, and it will take our count inside of data, this count, and just increment it by 1. And so as we see here, Vue has provided us a very structured way of organizing our code, right? We have data, computed, and methods. But the thing is that over time, especially as some components got really big and then there were a lot of features in certain components, people wanted another way to basically share functionality and state that wasn't as restrictive as the options API. Because while structure is good, sometimes we need flexibility. And so, currently in Vue 2, there are things like mixins, provide inject, and people have found ways to sort of hack around it, but usually they came with certain trade-offs that were, well, less than ideal. And so what we've done here is let's go ahead and take a look at the same code inside of the composition API. Now, don't worry, if you're seeing this, this is a lot to take in right now. I don't expect you to understand this. We will be breaking all of this down so that by the time we're done with this talk, you will be able to understand what's on the right-hand side. But as you can see here, it's quite different in the sense that what we have here is all of our data, computed, and methods inside of this giant setup block. And again, we'll go into detail what's going on. But as you can see, the composition API looks quite different from the options in that it's much more free flow and a lot more flexibility. Now, to settle this rumor, I think we will be dealing with this for quite some time. But the first thing I want to clarify before we continue on is that the composition API does not replace the options API. So I'll say that one more time. The composition API does not replace the options API. As I stated earlier, when we define composition API, it's really an alternative method for defining and like sort of writing and organizing your Vue code. And so this is not an either or, like, oh, should my entire app be written in Options API or should it be written in Composition API? You know, one of the things I think that's really strong about Vue's position on these things is that it allows you to choose what's best for your team. And so there are a lot of things to consider when choosing the different ones, and we'll be talking about some of that. But ultimately, know that the Composition API and Options API are meant to coexist and basically be able to handle both at the same time and allow your team to pick and choose what's best for you. Okay, that said, as far as trade-offs go, right, Composition API, there are we talked a little bit about the benefits as far as flexibility. And to be honest, I think most people, when they're talking about Composition API on the resources, when you Google, we're talking about all the wonderful things about it. And so while I think the benefits will sort of surface more organically, I like to sort of highlight some of the trade-offs because this is the thing I think that's important to making good decisions when whether or not to use the Options API or the Composition API. And so the first of which is that, as we saw in the example earlier, the Composition API can actually seem more verbose because in the Options API, it was actually very clear, right? What's being tracked, what's computed, what is methods. And so it's organized in a way that's easy to understand, and even someone with minimal knowledge of JavaScript or even Vue can get a sense of what's happening. In addition, because the Composition API has more sort of freedom in this regard, it also does require a lot more, or I wouldn't say a lot, but it does require more JavaScript knowledge. So someone who might only understand the basics of JavaScript would probably have a more challenging time working with the Composition API. So in other words, there's a higher onboarding cost. In addition, it does require a deeper level of Vue.js in order to basically to use it, because at a high level, what the Composition API does is it allows you to expose a block of JavaScript and then manually sprinkle in Vue magic to like do the things you want it to do. But again, this means that now you need to be much more familiar with how the APIs work underneath and do things that you kind of took for granted that the Options API did for you automatically. And finally, because now we sort of have this free form, like sort of less structure, like you don't have predefined options, this means that the architectural decisions in your app are now entirely up to you. And this is a double-edged sword, of course, right? Like while this gives you the freedom to organize things in a way that might be more efficient, this does give also the opportunity to end up creating anti-patterns or foot guns that might inadvertently hurt your sort of software architecture. So again, it's trade-offs, right? It's not that the Options API is perfect or the Composition API is perfect. They each have their trade-offs, and you need to understand when it's best to use one versus the other. All right. So let's go ahead and break down the Composition API. And we're going to start with the very simple component that is responsible for simply tracking the count. And so what we see here is that the key thing to indicate whether or not someone is using the Composition API inside of a Vue component is this setup keyword. This is the single indicator that this is the Composition API is basically being used. And so the setup method has two optional arguments that it's automatically passed on every component. And the first of which is the props. So any props that are being passed down into the component. And so for those who are new to Vue, props are basically just a way of passing down data from the parent to the child. And then you also have this context object. And so for those who might be new to this, the context object is also frequently shorthanded to CTX inside of code bases. So something I just want you to know. So when you see that, it just stands for context. And inside of this context object, you get access to three properties. You get access to the component's attributes, their slots, and the emit function. And so in case you're ever looking for this kind of stuff inside of your setup function, just know that this is available to you. And so there are two main parts when it comes to the setup function. The first of which is the code you want to basically write in order to compose your components logic and these sort of things. And so in this case, it's basically all we're doing is declaring a constant of count and setting it to 0. And so as you can see here, we are now basically in plain JavaScript world. So everything that you would normally write in JavaScript, it works in here and basically acts as the way you would expect. And the second part here is what is being returned to the component. In other words, this is the object that will expose certain properties to the component that we can use later. So in this case, we are exposing the count to the component that we might use, say, inside of our template and render it out. But the problem with this, though, for those who have been coding with JavaScript for a while, is you'll probably notice that this is actually going to be static. There's nothing that's magic about this because we're in plain JavaScript. Whereas when we're using things like tracking count in the data store, Vue would automatically attach reactivity to this. Basically, in the future, if we try to update count, let me skip back a bit. Whenever we try to update count, basically Vue is not tracking it as a dependency and will not update everywhere that it needs to go. So now that we know this, let's go ahead and move forward with learning how composition API. Let's say the slide's a little bit different. Okay. Okay, yeah. So let's talk about some additional fundamentals when it comes to the composition API. So the first of which is that here we have a, hold on a sec. I think my slides got rearranged by accident. This is, okay, we are good. It just had a different, just want to make sure. Okay, perfect. So we're gonna start over now with our counter component example here. And at the top, we can see here we have a data that's tracking our count and is being rendered inside of our template on the bottom. And so how would this look if we wanted to do this inside of composition API? Well, we'll go ahead and use the setup method and return ourselves back to the point where we have declared our instance of const count equals 0. And we can see that it's rendering on the bottom with the handlebars and count. And so in Vue 3, one of the new things that's going to be used a lot, which is different from Vue 2, is the fact that we're going to have helper methods. In other words, these are functions that Vue will provide us in order to perform certain actions. And the first one we're going to talk about is ref, which stands for reference. And so what we're going to do is let's start by importing our helper method from Vue. And so using standard JavaScript, it is simply import curly brace ref from Vue. And then what we're going to do is we're going to apply ref to the value that we want to be reactive. And so if you think about it another way, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, Vue, we want to create a reference to this value that we want you to track. And just like that, by doing this, you have now created a reactive data property inside of the setup function. Now, the thing about references, though, is that they have a bit of a gotcha when it comes to using them. Let's say we have a method that we call increment count, and it's a function, and all we want to do is increment it by 1. This is fairly standard for a counter app. And so when we're looking at this, you might be thinking like, okay, well, your first instinct for those who have been writing Vue for a while is to prepend our count variable with the this context. But the problem is that we're actually inside of the setup method. So there is no Vue instance being attached to the this instance that we're used to in, say, Vue 2, or more importantly, in the options API, where this would normally work inside of the methods option. And so this context does not work. On the other hand, then you might be thinking, well, okay, maybe I should just leave it as count plus equal 1. But again, for those of us who have been working with JavaScript for a while, this won't work either because count is currently a constant and we can't update the value of it. And so the question is sort of, well, then what do we do instead? And so whenever we change a variable into a reference, we have to actually access the value of the property by extending it with .value. And so by doing it like this, then you actually get access to the value of the property, and that's what you can update, and then Vue will know what to do accordingly. And so now if we were to, for example, call increment count, it will update count to 1 because the reference value will be updated to 1. And then we'll see that change inside of the template. Okay, so I don't know about you, but when I first saw this, or frankly, when I first started using it, I constantly forgot to use the dot value. It felt a little unintuitive and was kind of hard to, basically, it took some getting used to in order to remember that whenever I use ref, I need to actually make sure that I use dot value. So is there a different way that we can do that might be a little bit more intuitive? And I'm happy to tell you that there is. So the next helper method I want to talk about is the reactive helper method. And so let's reset our counter example, and we can get back to our static count equals 0. And so the way we would use reactive is, just like ref, we would go ahead and import our reactive helper method from view. And then inside of here, let's go ahead and start by declaring a constant called state, where we will create a reactive object. And so one way to think of state at this point is think of it a little bit like the data option, right? Because what the data option did for us inside of the options API is all it did was it was a function that returned an object that was reactive. Like everything inside of it is reactive. And this is the closest mental model that I think will get us there. So that's why I'm calling it state, because if I call it data, then it'll get confused with the data options. And so all we need to do now is, because again, setup is consisted of two parts, we set up our state variable, and we also need to make sure we return it and expose it to the component so that you can use it later on. And so what we do now is, inside of our object, we can now move our count variable inside as basically a key value pair of this reactive object. And what this allows us to do is to then also remove count from the object that's being exposed. And then as a result now, we have a reactive count that can be actually tracked. And so the one thing, though, is that since we're exporting state instead of count, our template now has to say state.count. Now, I'll address this in a little bit, but what's really nice about creating reactive objects is that let's go back to the point where we wanted to actually increment our count, right? When we were using ref, we had this count value here, where we had to basically access the value of the property. Well, when you're using reactive objects, you no longer have to remember this .value property. And instead, you can access it directly just as you would expect by saying state.count and then plus equals 1, and view will handle the rest. And this follows much more sort of declarative code that we're used to with JavaScript, is that we declare the thing we want and then we want to update it. We don't have to remember there's this other thing that we need to do in order to basically update said value. And so this, to me, follows much more of what we're used to, because in other words, you can think of state as this context, because all you're doing is you're referring to the data, or well, let me be more accurate, not necessarily this, but because this could automatically refer to the data property, like state is basically data at this point. And so to me, this is a closer mental model to what we're normally used to when writing options API, while still leveraging some of the benefits that composition API provides us. Now, of course, some of your initial thoughts, I know mine was, is that, oh, this state thing down here, I don't like this. Because now this means that my templates are going to be polluted with state dot, and oof, that is annoying, right? We try to reduce clutter in our code, and having to prepend this with state isn't great. But don't worry, I have a solution for you. Another helper method you'll want to know about when working with reactive, the reactive helper method, is something called toRefs. And so back in our example, let's go ahead and import our toRefs helper method. So this is the problem that we have, and we want to get rid of it. And so here's the thing. Your first instinct when it comes to this is to probably destructure state, because after all, this is plain JavaScript, is it not? And while this is true, this is plain JavaScript, and this would allow you to break up your state object into its individual pieces. When you do this with plain JavaScript, it removes and breaks the reactivity. In other words, Vue will stop tracking the individual pieces inside a reactive. And so this is where you basically and so going forward, even though you're like, oh, well, this means that I can call count, this might work initially, but again, it's no longer being tracked by Vue, and ergo, you basically lost all the reactivity that you are basically leveraging Vue for to help you watch all of the changes. But don't worry, we're not stuck. As you probably guessed from the helper method we talked about earlier, so yes, this does not work. In other words, or sorry, it works, but it doesn't work the way you want it to. So please don't do this. The helper method we're going to import here, as I indicated at the beginning of this section is toRefs. And so as you might basically deduce from the way the helper method is named, is that what toRefs does is convert something into the refs that we learned earlier. And so it basically turns things to references. And so what we do is we pass our state into toRefs. And what that will do is then allow us to actually properly destructure it into the reactive components. And then our template can now return back to the count and no longer state.count. And this works exactly as you want. OK. So with that, believe it or not, these are the fundamental pieces of working with the composition API in terms of reactive data. And so let's do, I think some live coding would be good, because I'd love to hear some of your questions as we're working through an example. And that way I can show you some code as we're going through. So let's see. Let me go to the event. All right. OK, cool. So if any of you have questions, feel free to post in here. But what we're going to do is I'm going to open up, I'm going to start a brand new project. So I'm going to do view create, let's do view create smashing meets to do. All right, so this is the view CLI. And I'm going ahead and just going to use the default view 3 preview, since we're going to go ahead and use this as a demo to see what's going on today. All right. And like I said, since this is a live coding demo, as you have any questions or just clarifications that you want regarding the composition API, I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability. Just feel free to drop them inside of the chat. All right, so here I have my smashing meets to do, and let's go ahead and open this up and start up our server. All right, so we have port 80 over here. So I'm going to head, whoop, and move to the wrong side, wrong monitor. Move this over here and bump this up a little bit. And then let's go ahead and open this up in VS Code. So let's bump that. Right. Close this. Here we go. All right. So bumping this up a bit so everyone can see a bit better. And we have our app.view here. This is a little too big. I'm going to go ahead and delete the hello world component. And then let's wipe these out. All right. And we should be good. Now, what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and practice what we did with the composition API. And what I want to do is we're just going to build a very simple to-do app because we have basically roughly 10 minutes left in this session. And I wanted to show you how the composition API works in practice. So here, let's go ahead and just set up our to-do app, right? So we have smashing meets to-do. So we save, right? We see that everything's updating here. Perfect. And so here we're going to have a list of our tasks. And so we're going to use our composition API here. And so, yeah, tsconfig is yelling at me. I think this is an extension. Let me just remove this. I'm currently beta testing an extension right now, and it looks like it is yelling at me. So let me see. It looks like it's not coming up quickly, but that's fine. We'll just leave it be. But just know that nothing is wrong right now. And so inside of here, we're going to go ahead and create our setup method. And let's go ahead and create our first basically list. So here we go. I'll have my task list. And then let's just give them numbers right now. 1, 2, 3. So the second part of this is we need to make sure we return the task list. And to show you that this works, we're going to go ahead and scroll up to the top. And inside of here, we're going to loop through a list here. And we're going to say for every task in task list. And the key for now, we're just going to, this is not best practice. We're just going to make it the task, which is currently just the actual number. And let's just render it. If we save it now, we see here that it has the 1, 2, 3, and it renders exactly as you would expect. Now, let's go ahead and show you what I mean in terms of like it is not reactive. So if we wanted to set up a method to push a new item, right? So here, let's add a button. And the button is add new task. So, you know, again, if we're writing to the standard view, add click, and then I would just have a method called add new task. Inside of our setup method, what we're going to do is we're going to create a standard JavaScript function that will serve as our method, because that's what we're going to be exposing into our component. So we have a const that's called add new task, and I'm going to use the arrow function to declare it. And I'm just going to say task list.push4. And then we're going to go ahead and expose this. I like to do things in alphabetical order, so let's do that. Add new task and save. So here now, I'm going to go ahead and cue the console on the bottom. When we actually click on this, you're going to see that nothing's happening. And this makes sense after all, because right now task list is a constant. There's nothing being tracked. And so what do we need to do? We need to actually make sure we need to actually turn this into a reactive data property. And so let's start by doing it the ref way, just for some practice. So we import from view. And I like to do it like this because this helps me with some of the autocomplete. Although ref is only 3 letters, so the odds of me mistyping that are fairly low. And so now that we have the ref, we can say ref, and then we can pass our array that we want to watch through ref. And then here now, well, when we save, actually, let's do this real quick. You can see now that the console is actually throwing us an error. So this is actually an improvement because at one point there was no error. And the view CLI is helping us by saying, hey, by the way, I know you're using a ref. And so if you want to change the thing you want to change, please make sure you use .value. And so here, we now go ahead and write .value. And so when we save now, you'll see when I add, it's now updating as you would expect. Now, again, I am personally a bigger fan of the reactive helper method because here's the thing, right? As we add new items, let's call it like task list 2, and we have another ref that's like 4, 5, 6. Every time you add a new ref, this means that you need to go inside here and then expose it accordingly. And so as you can see, like as your setup function begins to grow, your return object is also going to grow as well. And data is one of those things to me where like it's just easier to have it tracked in one place, and I don't have to like update it in one place and then have it drop down to another. And so this is why personally I prefer, again, let's just assume this is the scenario where we have task list 1 and task list 2. I'm going to swap it over to reactive instead of ref. And so now we can say const, I like to call it state to make it very explicit. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and pull in our task lists that were, task list 1 and task list 2. And then we're going to go ahead and switch this over because we're now in the object. We don't need equals with this. And we can delete our ref wrapper. And then I just need to add a comma. Once I save, everything breaks, which is totally fine. Because why? Because we've tried to return our object with these things that don't exist. And so we need our two refs helper method to do what I'm trying to do here. So two refs here. And then when we expose, now we can consolidate this entire thing into ... two refs, and then our state. So now when I save, task list is not defined. Yes, that makes sense. This does not work still. Why? Because task list is now inside of our state. So we need to update task list here and say state.taskList. So now when we save, I need to do a hard refresh, I believe. There we go. All right. And we add to the task. Look at that. Everything is working exactly as you would expect. And what's great about this is now, right, as we go forward and add new properties into this, task list 3, and then A, B, C, right? Then because it's already being returned as a destructured object, you now have that additional benefit of not having to worry about what's being returned. You know that it's basically being used inside of state, and Vue will take care of it. And so for these reasons, if you ask me between ref and reactive, which is preferred, I think reactive is the closest mental model we have to the options API. And because of that, we then have the ability to basically allow us to onboard people a lot easier into the composition API when we decide to use it. Now, the other thing that I haven't covered just yet that we're going to cover in the last few minutes is the idea of computed properties. So what happens in the instance that we want to say, for example, return a list that's doubled whatever that task list is? So in this case, right, I'm going to go ahead and actually, I'm just going to go ahead and render it out as a p tag so we can see it in one line. So here we're going to do task list 2. Duplicate key, task list. Oh, right. I have double that. My fault. OK, there we go. So we have our array here, and then let's go ahead and actually, yeah, that's fine. And so what if we wanted to make task list to a computed property so that we double every item and that's what we return? And so typically inside of your options, you would have that computed option, and then you would define task list 2 inside of it. But what we're going to do here is we're going to import another helper method, which you might have guessed is called computed. What we can do here is I'm going to go ahead and move this out for a second, is const task list 2 is going to be equal to what? And so just like we declare JavaScript and then basically declare the type, and so state is now a reactive object, we want a computed property. And so it's a method, and it takes a callback function, which is actually what we normally do inside of our computed properties. Because in here, right, if we were to rewrite here and say double count, remember that we're actually calling a function, and the function is what returns like this.count times 2. So this is actually still consistent with the mental model we're familiar with. It's just we're now have to mentally think about it in the sense that we're passing computed method a callback function. And inside of this callback function, then I can say return, I can say state.taskList.map, and then I'll say for every item, return item times 2. Now this won't work because task list is currently a computed property and I need to expose it. It's no longer inside of my state. So task list 2 here, if I save, you'll see now that task list has been updated correctly into 2, 4, and 6. And so the final thing I want you to leave you with in terms of the computed property is that this is not the only way to write computed properties. Sometimes we actually want to group everything together inside of the same state object. So believe it or not, we can take this task list 2 and drop it inside of our reactive state. And then I need to see what I mean. You have to manage like what's being exported. Lots of steps. When refresh, you'll see now that it works exactly as you want. It has here your task list 2, and the computed property is our state, which is referring to here. And it'll check the task list and then map and return double the item. And that's basically like the high level of how you use reactive data, computed properties, and methods inside of your composition API setup function. Now, with that said, I think we have a couple minutes left on the clock before some Q&A. The one thing I'm happy to announce at this event that will be going live shortly, so I'll get a sneak preview of it, is that the Jamstack Explorers, which is Netlify's learning platform for basically free courses on doing things with the Jamstack along with different frameworks and these sort of things, there is actually going to be a composition API course that I'll be releasing basically today. And so, you know, for those who want a sneak peek, I'll make sure to drop that in the chat. I think here we go. This should be the right link. And so basically, to give you a quick preview, what you get here is you'll be building a sort of working on a mini game that I've designed with the Options API, and you'll have the opportunity to learn, sort of reinforce some of the concepts we talked about today, dive into some additional ones like lifecycle hooks, watch, and those sort of things, and also get hands-on practice with basically moving things from the Options API to the Composition API. So, you know, as far as resources go, be sure to bookmark that and check that out if you want to learn more about the Composition API. And finally, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to spend it here with me and basically chat about Vue 3's new Composition API. Again, if you're looking for me on the Internet of Things, you can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/BenCodeZen. And I also have a YouTube channel if you're looking for additional dev related content, youtube.com/BenCodeZen. So with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Excellent, Ben. Wow, look at you. I'm still kind of very much impressed with your jumper, but also with your design skills and your coding skills when it comes to the Jamstack Explorer and the Composition API as well. So thank you so much for all your insights and all. We did have a couple of questions in here. I know that we're just a little bit beyond schedule. I don't want to be respectful of everybody's time. So if you have more questions than the ones I'm going to bring up, please go into the Q&A with Ben and just ask directly. In the meantime, again, a round of clap emoji is always in order in here. One question, Ben, came from Aaron. And Aaron was wondering, knowing that Vue.js can be inserted into an HTML template as an external script from a CDN, can Composition API be used, still be used in this case?
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as I'm aware, yep, it should still work exactly as expected. It's basically an alternate way of writing. So for those of us who are dropping in Vue as a CDN package, basically think of it like dropping in jQuery to enhance your page. You should be able to use the composition API in Vue 3 without any problems. If you're using Vue 2, I forgot to mention this, but there is a composition API plugin, but that will require the Vue CLI. So that is the main difference.
Okay. One other thing that actually briefly came up, but I think it was gone then just half a minute later or so for some reason, was a question about the ecosystem in Jamstack. So we have a lot of stuff that's been happening over the last couple of years. It seems like Jamstack has exploded and everybody is either on headless or static or, Next.js or anything of the kind. It seems like it's just booming. So that brings us to the question of what is next. Are we at the point where most issues are kind of solved? Or like, what are some of the, I would say, very critical, important questions, both in the space of Jamstack, but also in Vue, React, and things like that? Which what keeps you awake at night, Ben?
Well, I wish I could say that all the problems in Jamstack were solved. I think one of the things I think we're dealing with as an ecosystem is while we love static and being able to pre-render things to make things faster for users, we know that basically having dynamic interaction and data is still a tricky thing. So I think we're still trying to figure out as an ecosystem how to handle things at scale so that we can balance and sort of keep that balance between things that are pre-rendered and caching things appropriately, but then also having dynamic pieces to the application. And so I think that's still something that everyone's still trying to figure out because as we know, right, deploying used to be as simple as dropping something in your FTP server and then you forget it, let it go.
But you don't use FTP anymore?
Only on days I'm feeling dangerous. Only on days I'm feeling dangerous.
Like when you're wearing a jumper?
Yep, exactly, right? I'm in my Darth Vader mode. I'm just FTPing all my code into the cloud. But yeah, I think there's a lot that, I think for those who haven't spent a lot of time with it, like as far as cache invalidation and making sure that it's properly propagated on CDN so people around the world can be optimized in package delivery and those sort of things, like there's so much that goes into it that I think we're still hunting for that great solution to get everyone on the same page. Right. But
one thing that's been kind of, I guess, on many people's mind when it comes to Jamstack is the incremental deployments. Where essentially you would be deploying just diffs, and then in some way it's possible, I believe, with Gatsby or so. If I'm not mistaken, I'm not quite sure at this point. But it seems like this is one of the things because we were running on Jamstack, and then every time we deploy, we need to regenerate a couple of thousands of pages and then re-upload. This is a little bit.
This is one of the problems.
We got faster because we really try to heavily optimize things, but it still takes a couple of minutes at least to make that right and all. So I think that there's still this very good question. I think there are still many things to be solved. Well, on the final note, maybe from my end, what are you most excited about in front-end 2021, Ben? What is going to change the world forever?
What is going to change the world forever? Gosh, I think my biggest excitement is seeing recently, I think there's been a lot bigger push for libraries to have much better official documentation. So I think I've seen that trend start to uptick. I know that the Vue community prides itself heavily in documentation, and whenever anyone's like, this is confusing, we actually have a whole team dedicated to like, why is this confusing and how can we make a better resource that people can rely upon? And I think I've seen that more consistently as like API libraries have come out, like the documentation is significantly better. You don't have to rely on Stack Overflow for all your answers anymore, and you can actually go straight to the docs. And so that's a trend I'd like to see continuing in 2021, because I think it'll make everyone's life easier if we can actually rely on the original developers to document the things that we're using and depending on every day.
Oh, totally. That sounds about right. Excellent. Well, maybe the final note for me before you kindly are invited to join the sessions where more people will have more questions.
Great.
How many of those jumpers do you have at home?
I think I have 3 at this point. This might be my favorite one, though. I'm not going to lie.
Okay, well, everybody has their favorite, which brings me to the challenge I would like to pose to all the wonderful attendees joining us today. I want to see your Christmas or winter holiday jumpers or anything like that. Please take a moment to pull them out from your, whenever they're hanging, I don't know, and just take a photo and put them on Slack. I would love to see them. The more, the merrier, but preferably your favorite one. Now, in the meantime, thank you so much, Ben, for joining us. Jumper-related emoji in the house, please. And I will see you a little bit later.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing all right.
All right. I have just put on a lovely Snapchat shoulder, custom made by myself. As you can see, amazing quality.
Very nice.
I think that does look a little bit better. I have some questions which I still have from chat. There is a few people in here already, so anyone who has questions, just feel free to post them. If you really want to be on screen, you can do that as well, and I can just let you in. So let me check what questions we still have ready. I have a question from earlier. Could you share what would happen if you return state without 2refs?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll go ahead and answer this one because maybe it was not as. All right, yeah, sounds good. Let's start with this question. So when we return, oh, I'm getting an echo. Let me see if I can feed. Let's see, is this any better? Okay, this is fine. So as far as the first question regarding what would happen if you return state without 2refs, basically it will break everything down as you would expect, but then based on what I've seen is that it will give you the piece as count, but it will be static at that point. So once it's returned, like it will no longer have reactivity. And so in that regard, it breaks in the sense that what you would expect it to do is so for Vue to track everything, because you've gone through the thing is you've gone through the effort of setting the reactive helper method, you've passed reactive, the state that you want to track. And then when you break it and you return it, then eventually you basically run into bugs. And so if your goal is to just return like a series of constants that's like static properties, then no need to go through the process of the reactive helper method and everything. Just declare your object inside of setup, return it, and then it will be a static property that Vue will never change and it will always stay the same. Yep. So this question I think we answered a little bit earlier, but just in case to reinforce. So Vue, for those who don't know, can be actually dropped onto an HTML page, just included as basically a CDN script. So basically, it's just like a minified bundle, no build tools needed in terms of Webpack. And it's actually a popular method for basically upgrading and enhancing HTML pages that might not be ready for a full build tool. This is particularly popular inside of legacy applications. And so that way you can progressively migrate what you have. And so if you're wondering like, oh, does this really work? And is this just theoretical? Like GitLab, which is a huge, one of the biggest basically code repositories that we have, as a competitor to GitHub. That's exactly what they did, actually. They were on a Ruby on Rails application, and they basically dropped Vue in as a CDN and slowly migrated things over until they could eventually build the business case to spend the time to actually reconfigure it, add the build tools, and pull it out, basically. And so, yes, Andre. So I just answered it, but happy to answer it again. At the TL, so the long story short with the 2refs is that you'll basically lose all the reactivity, which you lose the reactivity, which is not what you'd expect given that you spent all this time setting up like importing reactive, passing it to the state and passing reactive. And no, of course, absolutely. Glad you can make it and be here live. And so, yeah, it'll basically break the reactivity and it won't work as you want. So if you just want an object that's static properties, just go ahead and just do your, const static state, for example. And then these are static variables that will be consistent throughout your app. That's cool. Then you can actually do the destructuring and it'll break it up and that works. But the moment you want reactivity, make sure you just pass the 2refs. And so to continue what the question from the CDN, so I mentioned that it's dropped in. So if you drop in the Vue 3 CDN, what that will allow you to do then is you can then write your app as you expect. And yes, you should be able to use the setup function and then write the composition API as you would expect, and it should work inside of your HTML. There's no special build step for it. It really is worth sort of repeating that the composition API is really an alternative to the options API. So there's nothing special about it beyond how you're writing your Vue app. And so Vue supports both natively. So I'll address Andre's point real quick regarding convincing boss not to use Angular anymore. Yeah, I think when it comes to the frameworks inside of teams and companies, the key thing I think when discussing new technologies is usually having to do with onboarding and those sort of things. So if you have a large company where everyone's already on Angular, it certainly does seem difficult to like sort of break everyone off of that, because obviously Angular is super opinionated in the way it does things, and this can be beneficial for larger clients. But just know that if you are presenting sort of the idea of using Vue inside of your company, like let people know that like it's one of those things where like it actually does have opinions. Like we have a whole style guide that it can enforce how things are done. We can, especially with Vue 3, there's even better TypeScript support, and so a lot of big companies are using Vue. And so if you need any other points as far as talking to stakeholders about Vue, happy to talk about it forward. But I think one of the best things, personally, I think that's Vue's selling point, is that as long as you have basic knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you can use Vue. You don't really require a lot of upfront learning that I think a lot of the other frameworks require before you actually get started. The story I'd love to tell is I taught a workshop a year ago, like an intro to Vue workshop, and a designer basically came who hadn't coded for like 5 years. They'd dabbled in HTML and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript. But in just an hour, I had her up and running with Vue, and she was building interactive applications and those sort of things. And I think that speaks to how easy it is to get onboarded and really build some really powerful things with Vue. And so the next question here we have is, what's missing in the ecosystem, in the landscape, as far as what we want to address, whether it's Jamstack and static rendering? And so I think Vitaly talked about this a little bit, but the idea here is that when you know that you have a set number of pages, then it's usually pretty fine for like a small site, right? You just generate the whole thing, deploy it, it's great. But the moment you get to really large sites where things might not necessarily change as often, there is a bit of this sort of question right now regarding how to best do incremental builds in a way that basically says, hey, everything is staying the same except for these 2 pages, so only rebuild these 2 pages. Of course, like while that seems simple algorithmically speaking, the concern is what happens when there are dependencies linking out, right? Because if we keep the old pages the same, but let's say the header has changed because we're updating navigation, you kind of do need to regenerate everything. But is there a way to like, and that's what I mean, like, is there a way to do this kind of stuff performantly so that you don't cache the wrong thing and serve old content to your users when you should have served newer ones? These are some of like the questions and challenges being answered by purely Jamstack sites. And so the other thing about Jamstack too, I think, which is a common misunderstanding, is that it only is for static things, basically. And so, if I'm building a small static site, but Jamstack is really just the idea that like you can integrate different APIs, so whether you're pulling in Stripe, like Algolia, like you can do different things that make your page really powerful. And so a lot of people connect like Hasura as a database. In fact, for those who like budgeting apps, there's an app called Lunch Money, which is built, we just talked with the founder, I think last night, and she built her entire thing basically using the Jamstack, which is incredible, just like bringing in bank information, tracking that, and creating an interactive web application. And so I think people are really starting to see the benefits of using what we already leverage and know as far as HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then allowing services like Netlify, for example, to help really offload some of those backend pieces and serverless functions so that it does what we want and it takes care of it, and we focus on solving the problems we care most about. All right, so let's see. Andre here, provider most using Angular, yes. Yeah, I think, Andre, to your point, Angular I would say they did a good job early on trying to cement in everyone's mind that because it was a Google framework, it was therefore like the enterprise framework, which I think is a bit of a misconception, given that it's funny because given that even Google itself, right, they came out with Polymer not that much longer after, right? And so if we were to say that like Angular were used across Google entirely, it kind of be one thing, but it was, again, it's sort of like a concept, a framework that works. But then obviously Facebook is using React, and I think it would be wrong to say that they're not using it at an enterprise scale. And similarly, Vue, even though it's an primarily open source and not backed by a single company, that doesn't make it any less enterprise. And its ability to be performant and to still provide the benefits of providing a really great developer experience while also solving our problems in a way that's easy to use, I think is one of its greatest strengths. And so, yeah, so Andre's comment here, there's a lot of overhead and bloat your shipping. Yeah. Yeah, there can be a lot of overhead when it comes to using build tools, which I think when I think people are talking about upgrading legacy applications to Vue, a lot of times the biggest misstep is saying, hey, let's stop feature development for like 2 months and like let's upgrade everything. Like no stakeholder will basically ever go for that. And so really what you should do is you go, okay, I have this new feature, and we're going to use the Vue CDN and we're going to just enhance this part, right? Like I know everything else is a Java backend and it's really slow, but let's just focus on this one part. And then once you do that successfully, right? Because it's a CDN. I mean, if you think about like, if your first thought is like, oh, I don't want to add additional payload to the page, I would probably look at what marketing is dropping as far as A/B testing and those sort of things. Those libraries are huge. So as a way of progressively migrating and removing technical debt, I think adding the CDN is a great way of just sort of like being like, hey, we're gonna do this small feature in Vue, and then that was really successful. Let's do this other small feature in Vue, and hey, over time you'll find that hey, this page now or like this section of the site is mostly Vue. Can we like use the Webpack to like optimize development experience, whatever? It gives a good way to have that conversation. So now you can actually say this will actually take like a week, and then we'll have the whole thing working, and we can like leverage this work going forward. Whereas when you do a full upgrade, as we all know, we are terrible at estimating how much time things take. So we're like, oh, it'll take 2 months. And really it takes like half a year. So that's the last thing you want to do as far as pissing off your stakeholders. Let's see. I was incoming the migrated e-commerce from English. Hey, nice. Very cool. I was not aware that the Mercedes-Benz passenger cars went from Angular to Vue. I'm going to have to make a note of that. I will. I do think that it's one thing I'd love to see us do is sort of surface more about the technologies that companies are using. But I know that sometimes they're a little bit hesitant about doing that just because it does look like they're backing a specific framework. When we know that especially large companies, when they have large technical departments, actually, you'd be surprised. A lot of times they actually have different departments use different frameworks. So for example, when I was at Politico, I think the creative team on the news side their familiar was React. And so we built everything on the basically on the app side with Vue, for example. And so if a company as small as, not that Politico is small, but compared to like enterprise level, like huge companies, if a news company like that can have fragmentation, I imagine that happens at other places too. So Angular JS V1. Yeah, I think that's what I think brought a lot of people to Vue initially, was that the migration from Angular 1 to Angular 2 was so jarring because they basically changed what people were used to. That's, I think, one of the things I'm really proud of as far as the Vue 2 to Vue 3 migration is that people, a lot of the questions we were getting at first were like, oh, well, shoot, does it mean like, should I wait for Vue 3 to learn Vue? And the answer was no, absolutely not. Not only do we port basically everything you know from Vue 2 over to Vue 3, but then we also give you a proper migration guide for understanding maybe some of the changes we made and why. And more importantly, anything that's additive, we're actually trying as much as humanly possible to backport some of that functionality to 2.7, which will be the next minor upgrade. And I think it's actually the final minor upgrade for Vue 2, so that people can still leverage some of the things we've learned over time as Vue 2 has grown. But then when they are finally ready to make that leap from 2.7 to 3, whatever, then it will be less of like basically a mental model shift. But everything you know and still love as far as like directives and all these sort of things, like all that still works exactly as you expect. So that's one thing I'm definitely really proud of as far as our major upgrade. All right. Yeah, I think with Cecilia back on stage, I don't want to distract from her anymore. I think I would love all eyes on her. She's a wonderful speaker, and I'd love to check it out too.
Yes, and I would like the opportunity to thank you very, very much for your time. And I want to get a lot of clap hands emojis and all that stuff, and Christmas sweaters in whatever kind of color you have there. Let's go to Michelle in stage.
Yeah, Darren, I think if you're still here, just real quick, let's see, I muted you. What does it come to do differently than standard Vue 3? Than standard Vue 3, syntactical. So Darren, so because it's now plain JavaScript inside, you can organize code much differently. So you can basically modularize your code into different JavaScript files that you can import into the setup function and basically compose features together. And that was harder to do with the options API. So that's, I think, one of the main benefits that comes with reusability and shareability. But again, happy to continue this conversation with you. Just like DM me on Twitter or something, and I'm happy to talk further with you regarding Vue 3. So thanks for stopping by. Thanks, everyone.